Continuing along with our newest string of Resident Evil spin-offs, we've come to the first non-mainline entry in the series that I had actually played before doing this retrospective, Resident Evil Revelations. This was a full premium Resident Evil title developed for Nintendo's, at the time, new 3DS system. The team at Capcom wanted to make a Resi game for the 3DS because they felt that the 3D capabilities of the system could lead to a, and I quote, tense, scary experience with a realistic atmosphere that could make players feel like there could be something lurking around every corner. This game would go on to be not only incredibly impressive given the limitations of the handheld, but also incredibly successful, with it being a very profitable and well-received title for Capcom. But the question is, has this little handheld spin-off from 13 years ago managed to remain impressive, or has it started to show its age a bit? Well, answering questions like that is what this retrospective is all about, so let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 19th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but I would definitely recommend checking those out if you're a big Resident Evil fan, or just someone who likes their stories complete. So for those of you that are interested in checking that out first, I'll have the full series playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil Revelations is a survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the Nintendo 3DS in 2012. The game takes place only a few months after the events of Resident Evil 4, with returning protagonist Jill Valentine and her new partner Parker Luciani being sent to find Chris Redfield, who has apparently gone missing yet again, which is, becoming a bit of a pattern for him, huh? This leads them to a cruise ship that's been left floating in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea called the Queen Zenobia, and when they board the ship to start looking for him, we quickly learn that the ship has, of course, been overrun with a new form of bioweapon that we've never seen before. The game is then primarily set on the Queen Zenobia, with the majority of the story revolving around Jill and Parker trying to figure out what happened to Chris, and, as is also par for the course at this point, uncovering a larger conspiracy about what happened here on the Zenobia. However, the game doesn't only take place from Jill's perspective, as Revelations actually does a lot of jumping around and giving us different POVs to build extra intrigue and further flesh out the overall story. On top of playing as Jill, we also play as Chris Redfield himself alongside his new partner Jessica Sharawat. We get flashbacks to Parker's time fighting off a bioterror attack in a large city alongside Jessica about a year before this game's events, and we get a brand new pair of BSAA agents named Keith Lumley and Quint Ketchum, or as I like to call them, Dumb and Dumber.
So, you followed Jessica home. You know where she lives now?
Almost. I had her until the very end, but I lost her near the... Hey! You think I'm a stalker, don't you?
You said it.
Jumping around between all these different characters who are each in their own places and playing their own role in the story really adds a lot of awesome variety to the overall experience, and also gives this game some pretty incredible pacing. I mean, seriously, I almost never got bored during my recent playthrough of the game because I was never spending too much time with one character. And any time that I was just about starting to get bored with that point of the story I was in, the game would then cut away to someone else, and any sort of fatigue that I was starting to feel would just instantly go away. Add on to this that the story of Revelations is very focused on the larger mystery behind what happened on the Zenobia and the conspiracy behind it, and you also have a ton of crazy twists and turns thrown at you throughout the entire thing that will have you second guessing what you thought you knew the entire time. It honestly leads to Revelations having one of the most entertaining stories out of the entire series. And if you're a fan of stories like Resident Evil 1, where you spend the whole game slowly piecing together what happened and who unleashed this horror on the larger population, then you would definitely be a big fan of the story here as well. Now, I'm sure those of you familiar with Revelations have already realized, but I should mention here that I didn't play the original 3DS release of the game for this video. About a year and a half after the 3DS release, Capcom put out ports of the game for consoles and PC, and I decided to record the game on the PC port for this video since it's the best available version of the game currently. This port is nearly one-to-one with the original, aside from having less compression on the textures, as well as a complete overhaul to the controls to make it play like a more traditional third-person shooter on the consoles. This overhaul allows the players to move around the environments with the left thumbstick while controlling the camera with the right, and also freely move around while shooting. But to get the closest thing to the original experience possible for the sake of the review, while also still getting the best looking footage for you guys, I decided to change the controls back to the original layout from the 3DS in the settings. The game originally had a control scheme that was basically identical to RE4 and RE5's controls, complete with the tank controls and not being able to move while shooting. Well, you can move while aiming in the original control scheme by just holding down an additional button, but it prevents you from adjusting your aim or firing your weapon while doing so it's not the most useful addition. And even though this is the PC version you're seeing here, it has to be said that this game is visually stunning for a 3DS title. In fact, I would go as far as to say that this is the best looking game ever released on the 3DS. If you go back and compare this footage to the original release, you'll see that the only real differences are the increased resolution and less compression on the textures. Everything else is just the same. There are so many incredibly detailed environments that not only look great, but also just feel alive thanks to the incredibly thick atmosphere that the team created for the Queen Zenobia. The level designers also made great use of colored lighting throughout the Zenobia, which I absolutely loved because I'm honestly just a sucker for some good colored lighting. And I just mentioned it in passing, but the atmosphere in this game is seriously just amazing. The designers wanted to give the Queen Zenobia a similar feel to locations from earlier titles in the series like the Spencer Mansion or the RPD, which in simpler terms means they wanted a highly atmospheric location that players would spend the duration of the game becoming familiar with. And something that unexpectedly really sells the overall atmosphere here is the new virus that the game's plot revolves around, the T-Abyss virus. The enemies and BOWs we encounter in this game have also been heavily inspired by an ocean theme, with those infected by the T-Abyss virus developing overly smooth skin that almost resembles that of a shark or a whale, as well as disfigured limbs that almost look like some sort of coral. Their designs are genuinely really clever and well thought out, and definitely go a long way in selling that abandoned cruise ship in the middle of the ocean vibe. And much like those earlier titles in the series, you'll only be able to access a very small amount of the Queen Zenobia at the start of the game, but you'll slowly find new key items, solve puzzles, and even just reach certain points in the story that will open up more of the ship for you to explore. This leads to a pretty interesting dynamic where you have that same slow-paced, atmospheric exploration of a larger location, but you also have the over-the-shoulder action gameplay of RE4 and 5. It feels a bit weird to have that action horror gameplay of the series in a title where you slowly explore and open up a non-linear environment, since those games have always been more linear, level-based experiences up to this point. But that being said, it kind of just works. It's like they've taken the best of both styles of mainline RE titles and just put them together in a shockingly natural way, and it leads to an overall experience that I honestly just love. I mean, seriously, every time I come back to this game after a few years away from it, I'm always shocked by just how much I enjoy it and wonder why I don't revisit it more often. Now, that being said, the gameplay here certainly isn't without its faults. The shooting in Revelations may control just like RE4 and 5, but that doesn't mean that it feels like them, which sounds weird, but let me explain. The combat in Revelations feels pretty floaty and honestly unsatisfying here, which I believe is mostly because there's little to no feedback when shooting enemies. The enemies in this game kind of just tank whatever damage you throw at them without any sort of reaction. You'll get small animations from enemies here and there when shooting them that does add some weight to things, and obviously the bigger the gun you're using, the more you're going to see these animations actually play. But the fact that more than half of your bullets here will hit enemies and they just won't react at all makes things feel a bit awkward. Compare this to RE4 or 5, where every time you shoot an enemy, they reel back in a believable, albeit sometimes exaggerated fashion that really adds weight to the overall experience and makes shooting at the BOWs feel satisfying. It's something that's present in Revelations, but just doesn't get utilized as often as it did in the earlier action horror titles, so it leaves it feeling a bit weaker by comparison. And while melee attacks are still here in Revelations, the stun states that allow for them are much less common, making melee attacks something that you do once in a while rather than something that you do in every single engagement. I think this was probably done to make things feel a bit more like the classic Resi titles, as it's hard to feel truly afraid of an enemy that you can just instantly stun and then go roundhouse kick into oblivion. But the thing is, roundhouse kicking an enemy into oblivion was really damn fun. Another interesting change with them is that at base, they do much less damage than they did in the other action titles of the series, but there is a new charge mechanic that allows you to hit harder than ever with them. This can be done by simply holding the button when going in for a melee attack, and the longer that you hold it, the more damage it will do once you finally release the button. A fully charged melee attack is devastating in this game, being able to kill some fairly tough enemies like hunters in a single strike. However, it will leave you vulnerable to attacks from other enemies for a very long time if you go for that full charge. So knowing what's going on around you at all times and how long you realistically have to charge your strike is critical here. So the melee is a bit weird because I thought that the charge mechanic was a super fun addition to the combat of these games, but I do wish that melee played more of an important role in things overall. Something that's pretty interesting in Revelations is the weapons sandbox. The weapons themselves are basically built on the same blueprint as those of RE4 and 5, with each weapon within a class having one distinct strength and one or two weaknesses that really make them stand out from one another and fill different roles. For example, one handgun might have really high damage compared to the others, but suffer in terms of its reload speed, magazine capacity, whatever it might be. This means that each individual weapon still has its place in the game even when you're late into your playthrough or even just playing through on New Game Plus. Which ones you prefer will essentially come down to your specific playstyle and preferences, which is, in my opinion, a fantastic example of good balancing within a sandbox. The twist that Revelations throws in, though, is the new custom parts system. As you play through the game, you'll come across different weapon parts scattered throughout the Zenobia that can then be added to your weapons as you please at any of the item boxes you find. Each weapon has a different number of slots available for these parts to fit into, which also plays a role in the strengths and weaknesses of each weapon, as weapons with better overall stats will have fewer slots available for custom parts, limiting how much you can increase the effectiveness of that weapon beyond its base stats. There are a bunch of parts here that you'll basically just find laying right in the middle of the path required to progress the story, but these are all of the weakest parts in the game. If you want to find the really good stuff, you'll have to venture off the beaten path and maybe solve a puzzle or find a secret somewhere, and if you do, you'll be rewarded handsomely for it. If you spend enough time really exploring the Zenobia throughout the campaign, you can have things by the end of the game like a shotgun that fires 2 shots with every pull of the trigger, has massively reduced pellet spread, and an additional 80% damage increase per pellet. This system has always been one of my favorite parts of the game, because it manages to ditch the traditional shop and currency system seen in RE4 and 5, and more directly reward the player for their exploration, as well as just give players more customization and freedom within their loadouts than they ever had in those games. And the final piece of the combat puzzle is the return of a legacy mechanic that's been missing from the series for a good while now: the emergency dodge from Resident Evil 3. In the game's original control scheme, if you hold down the X or A button on the controller and flick the thumbstick in any direction just as an attack connects, you'll be able to avoid taking damage by swiftly sidestepping in that direction. This works on almost every single attack in the game, though some of them are a little trickier to dodge than others, just due to the animations being a little harder to read. Some of them can be so tricky, in fact, that there's a lot of misinformation out there about how the dodge mechanic in Revelations actually works, saying that you need to do things like learn which direction each individual attack in the game has to be dodged in. But these things aren't true, as I've always personally just stuck to flicking the stick towards the enemy, since it will always work, and also put me right behind them after the animation finishes, allowing for some extra free shots on them while they not only recover from their attack animation, but also try to turn around to face me again. Much like RE3's dodge, this is a mechanic that can be a bit difficult to get to grips with, but once you're used to it, it feels so badass to be able to just avoid all the damage enemies are throwing at you, especially in some of the boss fights towards the end of the game. It's a really fun mechanic that poses a bit of a challenge while initially learning it, but offers so much reward for those who put in the effort to master it. and it even feels more at home here than it ever did in RE3 thanks to the more action-heavy style of the combat in Revelations. I'll personally never say no to a good dodge move in a Resi game, so of course I'm a really big fan of this one. So aside from the general floatiness and lack of impact, the combat here is pretty good. It's unfortunate that the one major issue with it is one that's present for literally the entirety of the time spent in combat and just generally makes the game feel a bit messier than it really should. But aside from that, I have nothing but good things to say about it. The only other major issue I really have with the gameplay here is the addition of the Genesis scanner. This is a little handheld scanner that the BSAA has recently started issuing to its agents to allow them to scan biological material in the field to assess what it is, or even just scan the environments for anything that might otherwise be hard to spot or might help them in their investigations. As far as its purpose in gameplay, scanning enemies with the Genesis, whether they're alive or dead, will add a certain percentage to this little counter at the top of the screen, and when this counter reaches 100%, the player will be rewarded with one free green herb for their troubles. So scanning every enemy that you come across is essential to make sure that you're always topped up on healing items. But the catch is that every time you scan a certain enemy type, the percentage that you get from them will slightly decrease. This might not sound so bad on paper, but if you're being diligent and making sure to scan all of your enemies, you'll find yourself at the point where each enemy will only give you literally 1% towards the counter before you've even gotten halfway through the game. So this mechanic is fine near the start, but quickly starts to feel really unrewarding and frankly just not worth your time to engage with. Now, the Genesis can also be used to reveal hidden items throughout the environments like ammo, healing items, and even weapon parts on rare occasions. This isn't necessarily a bad addition either, but I've personally never loved the idea of just walking into a room and whipping out a scanner like I'm playing Metroid Prime in my Resident Evil game. Which, no shade to Metroid Prime, those games are great, but it just feels kind of out of place in a Resi game, and I also hate how it puts this big ol' filter over environments that otherwise look really damn good. It leads to me just not really using the Genesis to find extra items all that often, which tends to put me in a worse spot than I really should be, since the game's healing and ammo economies seem to be balanced around the idea that you will be going around and scanning absolutely everything. It can be pretty useful when you're in a pinch, but I've personally just never liked how much the game tries to push you into it and the effect that it has on your exploration. My other personal nitpick with Revelations is the TV-style previously on segments that you get at the start of every episode, or just every time you load your save file from the menu. These segments were very popular at the time of Revelations' release, as episodic game releases that modeled themselves off of TV shows were in their absolute prime back in 2012, so it's really hard to blame them because I understand why they're here. They're just chasing a popular trend, and as much as some people hate to look at it this way, video games are a business, so they were just trying to make money. This was a popular format, and we're talking about a handheld game here, so it was naturally designed for shorter play sessions. A recap like this could obviously be really helpful if you were playing this game in shorter sessions and taking long breaks in between, but the issue is that they play all the time, even if you don't get up and take a break. Like I mentioned before, these will play at the end of every single episode in the game, meaning that roughly every 30 minutes or so, the game will throw a recap at you just to make sure you aren't forgetting the important parts of the story. Like I said, not a glaring negative or anything, and you can of course just skip these, but it's another personal complaint because I've never really cared for the episodic game format, and they throw them at you a lot for some reason. But despite the complaints that I have with it, I think Revelations is a great Resident Evil game. It brings back that slow-paced exploration that's been completely absent from the series since Resident Evil 0, mixes it with the over-the-shoulder action of RE4 and 5, and brings a lot of great new additions of its own to the formula. It's certainly not without its issues, with things like the floaty and weightless combat and other minor annoyances definitely being present, but it's generally just such a positive experience that it's really easy to look past those things. It also has a story that, while not my favorite in the series, is genuinely one of the most entertaining Resi stories we've ever gotten. And while I'm personally someone who cares more about the gameplay than the story, that certainly makes it easier to appreciate this game. Revelations is easily the strongest spin-off we've covered in the retrospective so far. In fact, it even beats out some of the mainline titles in terms of enjoyment for me. And that's an insanely impressive feat considering that this game was developed for a handheld system. It also holds up on home consoles and PC shockingly well, which is something that can't be said for a lot of handheld games that eventually get ported over. If you're a Resident Evil fan and you haven't checked out Revelations before, I would highly recommend that you do so. I can guarantee that even if it doesn't become one of your favorite Resi titles, you'll definitely be impressed by how ambitious this was for a 3DS game, and be able to respect the hell out of it if nothing else. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil Revelations an 8.2. Hey guys, thanks for making it all the way to the end of another video. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, feel free to leave a like, a sub, just anything to help out with the algorithm. And if you really enjoyed it, consider supporting me even further through my YouTube memberships or my Patreon. It really goes a long way in helping series like this actually happen, and you can get things like behind the scenes updates, early video access, and more. Of course, a huge thank you to everyone who already does contribute. It really does go a long way, and I can't thank you guys enough. With all that being said though, we've got a few interesting videos coming up on the channel soon, so I've got to get back to working on those. Once again, I hope you guys enjoyed, I hope y'all have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.